software in the world. It's a pleasure to get the chance to talk to you. I know I've talked to some of you before, so hello again to those who've met me before. Before I get started, let me just say I have got a bit of a cold, so if I sound a bit husky or if I lose my voice halfway through, my apologies, but I'll do my best to get through this. So what I'd like to do today is just give you a brief introduction to what LEAP is. I want to say a few words about how it can be used at the municipal scale, and particularly talk about some of the challenges of doing this kind of greenhouse gas mitigation planning at the municipal scale, and then show you a demonstration of the software itself. And please do type any questions in the chat window. Feel free to type in lots of questions, and I'll try and keep an eye on the chat window, and we'll address those as we go on. Don't feel you have to wait till the end to ask some questions. Okay, so let's get started. So I know some of you have probably seen LEAP before, but I'm going to talk about this as though most of you have never seen this thing. So LEAP is a piece of software for Windows computers designed to help people do energy policy and climate change mitigation assessment. And what makes LEAP different from some other tools is that it's really designed to be as user-friendly as possible. It's not really aimed at people who are serious professional modelers, but rather we've tried to make something that's usable by people who are maybe planners or work in energy ministries, environment ministries, or work in sort of planning offices. The software itself is focused primarily on the energy sector, so it's used for thinking about energy policy and energy-related emissions, whether that be greenhouse gas emissions or air pollutants. But it does also have some capabilities for looking at non-energy sector related emissions, and it's sort of increasingly powerful in that area, and we have a new version coming out in a few months' time that is particularly focused on the issue of biomass energy and forestry and disaggregated sort of land-based energy resources like solar and wind. Another thing that makes LEAP special is it's really not just a model. So there's many other tools out there that are very powerful modeling tools, but they don't pay very much attention at all to sort of helping you do all the other tasks that you need to do when you're doing this kind of exercise. So, how do you process the data that goes into models? How do you visualize the results? How do you engage with stakeholders about the kind of analysis you've been doing? So LEAP is probably as much focused on those issues as it is on actual modeling. I think I was having a look through the source code the other day, and I think there's probably 90% of the source code is about data management and results visualization. Only a relatively small amount is the actual sort of calculations within the software. So that's a very important part of what we're trying to do with the software. And then in terms of how we've sort of gone about trying to make it user-friendly, because everyone claims their software is user-friendly, but what we've tried to do in LEAP is a few different things. One is make the calculations very transparent. So there should be no sort of magical black boxes happening. It should be very easy when you're using LEAP to understand why the results are what they are. There's nothing too complicated going on behind the scenes. We've tried to make it also very flexible in terms of data structures, so it can adapt to very different situations. So it's not a model of a particular country, but it's a sort of flexible framework that can be adapted to different countries and situations. It also works at multiple scales, so it's not just for working at the national scale. It has also been widely applied at sort of subnational scales, including the municipal scale. We've also tried to give people a choice of methodologies. So the idea is that we don't say there's one right or wrong way of doing something. We try and give you a choice of methods. So typically there'll be some methods that are quite simple so that you can get started very quickly, even if you don't have too much data. And then there'll be other methods that maybe give you a bit more insight, but they require a bit more data. So you can kind of graduate from very simple methods, up to using more sophisticated methods later on. And the idea is that this is all packaged up into a system that lets you get started fairly quickly without having to build extremely complicated models. So you can build something that's fairly simple initially, and then you can start to focus in and build more sophisticated models later on, but you can get started and you can get useful results out of it fairly quickly. As I mentioned, it is a Windows-based software tool, so it does require that you're using a Windows-based computer. It doesn't run, at least it doesn't readily run on Apple computers, and it's not an internet-based system, so you don't have to have an internet connection to use it. But there are various features in it that will take advantage of being connected to the internet, but it's not a requirement. The software itself is available for free to government agencies, universities, and NGOs in low and middle income countries. There is a license fee for if you don't fall into one of those categories. So if you're like a consulting company in a Western European nation, then there will be then there is a license fee. And the basic approach that we've taken there is that we're trying to ask people to pay what they can towards using the software. And the fees that we generate from the license sales are used to support, to provide free technical support to all users. The website for LEAP is written down there on screen, energycommunity.org. If you're interested in LEAP, I would definitely encourage you to visit that website and to sign up and join that community. It's a very active community. I think we have over 34,000 members now. And there's very good technical support discussions, very active. So if you're using LEAP, you can usually find an answer to whatever your question is by just searching through the technical support forums, because there's many questions already been asked. So, please do go and join that. It's free. You can also download the software itself from that website. Okay, so here's the structure of LEAP itself, just to give a rough idea of the kind of calculations it's doing. I won't go into a lot of detail. But the basic approach in LEAP is that you always start by thinking about demand. So it's a demand-driven model. So you don't start by thinking about what power plants you're going to build. You start by thinking about what are the needs for energy in your society. So the demand analysis, I don't know if you can see if I'm pointing there. So the demand analysis in LEAP is the place where you think about energy demand. So that would be things like sort of energy use in buildings, industry, transport, services, and households. Those are all agriculture as well. So anywhere where you're sort of consuming electricity or you're combusting fuels, you'll deal with that under the demand analysis. And that's the basic approach in LEAP is, there's different ways of doing things, but the way that we usually suggest people to structure their demand analysis is to break things down into sectors, subsectors, end uses, and technologies, so that you can really start to get a feel for why societies need energy. So people don't. Energy is not an end in itself. It's sort of a means to an end for satisfying basic end uses. So people need energy for cooking, or they need energy for heating, but they don't need energy itself. The idea in LEAP is to do that kind of analysis where you consider the needs for energy in society, and you build up a sort of a model of how people are using energy in whatever area you're modeling. So it might be a country or it might be a municipality. The demand analysis then feeds into what we call a transformation analysis. That's where you think about how do you provide that energy. So that's where you think about things like your electric generation sector. So you might have a requirement for electricity coming from your demand analysis, and then you might have a transformation analysis that says, how am I going to generate that electricity? Or in other countries, it might be other things going on. It might be oil refining, it might be transmission and distribution, it might be even in African countries, it might be things like charcoal making. So it's always a question of how do you take your primary energy and use that to try and meet your needs for your final consumption of fuels going on in your demand analysis. And then once you've done that, you can then think about your resources. So that's where you compare your needs for energy, so your needs for coal or wood or solar energy, to what kinds of resources are available. So under the resource analysis, you could say, what kind of resources do I have? How much coal is in the ground, or how much land area do I have to grow wood energy, or how much land area do I have to potentially put up wind turbines to generate wind energy? So that's the resource analysis. And then finally, there's a part down below where you can look at non-energy sector greenhouse gas emissions. So that lets you think about all the sectors that you wouldn't already have dealt with under energy. So that would be things like forestry, land use change, industrial process emissions, solid waste sector, those kinds of things. So any sectors where there are emissions going on, but they're not energy related. So that's kind of like the main spine of the calculations through the model. Hanging off the sides here, you can see there's two sort of additional types of calculations. One is environmental loadings. So wherever a fuel is combusted in your model, you can associate a set of emission factors. So, if there's gasoline being burnt in the car, or petrol being burnt in the car, then you can associate emission factors with that, which allow you to calculate the loadings or the overall pollutant loadings for each different pollutant. So whether it's greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide or methane, or whether it's air pollutants like carbon monoxide or VOCs or particulates, you can use these emission factors to calculate the overall emissions from your country. And then over here on the right, and I should just say, and that happens both under the demand sector where you're burning fuel. So here, if you're burning if you're burning natural gas for cooking in households, or if you're burning petrol in a car in the transport sector, that would all happen under the demand analysis. And then if you're burning coal in a power plant or natural gas in a power plant, that would happen under transformation analysis. Okay, and now over here on the right, we have what's called integrated cost benefit analysis. So this is a place where you can count up the costs of implementing different policies. So this only really becomes relevant once you're doing scenario analysis. So scenario analysis is very sort of key to LEAP. The idea in LEAP is that you don't just look at the country as it is today, but you actually tell a plausible, consistent story about how your energy system might evolve over time. So, for example, your households might be growing, so the number of people cooking is going to grow, or the transport sector will grow as the GDP grows. So everything is sort of dynamic in LEAP and can change over time. And then what you can do is look at alternative scenarios that explore alternative policies. So, for example, you might have a policy to look at more fuel-efficient vehicles, or to look at the promotion of renewable energy. You can look at those policies, and then you can use the integrated cost-benefit analysis to explore what would be the costs of doing those policies. So typically the cost would be capital costs and operating and maintenance costs, or possibly even saved fuel costs. So just to give an example, say you're doing more energy efficiency in the household sector, typically that will mean buying more expensive but more efficient devices. So, you might have more efficient refrigerators or more efficient light bulbs. They're going to cost more, although typically they'll last longer. They'll cost more than your standard refrigerators, but they will save electricity. That in turn will mean that you don't have to produce as much electricity down here in your electric generation sector. So what you can do in LEAP is look at the trade-off. Is it better to spend more money on energy efficiency here and then save money on fuel consumption down here? Those are the kinds of things you can explore in the model. And LEAP will do all of those calculations for you and show you sort of the net present value of one scenario versus another. Okay, so that's most of the boxes. And then over here, there's one box hanging off here on the left. That's a new kind of calculation that we're doing now in LEAP. At the moment, it only works at the national scale, but we hope it will work at the urban scale very soon. The idea there is that you can take the emissions that you calculate in LEAP and you can feed them into a separate model, which is based on it's based on a large global atmospheric geochemistry model combined with a set of dose response functions. And that model basically lets you translate emissions into impacts. So it basically takes the emissions coming out of LEAP and it looks at, or rather it looks at the difference in emissions between different scenarios, and it turns those numbers into estimates of avoided health and ecosystem damages. So the health damages at the moment are basically mortality. So you're seeing how many deaths are you avoiding by pursuing different policies. And the ecosystem impacts are avoided crop losses. So, particularly ozone and particulates, and particularly ozone emissions have a large, or rather, ozone pollution has a large impact on the rate of growth of crops. So there's like a very serious impacts on growing crops, and you can look at those through this model. So you can get some idea of how many million tons of wheat or rice or soy are you going to be able to avoid losing by pursuing policies that involve cleaner air. Okay, so that's kind of the scope of the calculations at the moment. I think I already mentioned most of this. So yes, LEAP is available at no charge to non-profit, academic and government institutions. One thing I should say is you can download the software here from energycommunity.org. When you download the software initially, and you can go and do that today, to fully utilize the software, you will need a username and password. So when you first install it, it works in a sort of demonstration version. You're not allowed to save any changes. You have to put in a username and password, and you have to get a license to get those username and passwords. You can apply for a license online on the website. Okay. I think I've already mentioned this. Okay, so I just want to give you a quick example of the kind of calculations you can do on the demand side, just to give you some idea of this is sort of really almost like a trivial example of the kinds of things you can do in LEAP. So let's think about energy demand analysis. And as I said, typically what we encourage people to do is to break their analysis down into sectors. So here we're seeing a household sector, and then we've broken that down into different subsectors. Here we're looking at urbanized and electrified versus rural electrified and non-electrified households. And then we've broken those households down into different end uses. So here we're really thinking about sort of the fundamental needs for energy in a society. And then below that, we can think about what are the different technologies and how efficient are those different technologies, and what technologies might be available for meeting those end uses. So you can see here, just to give you a very simple example of the kind of calculations that go on in the model, here we've got a system where we've got 8 million households, 30% of those are urban, all of those are electrified, everyone, all of those people have lighting, and then here we have two different technologies for lighting. So this might be, kind of standard light bulbs versus LED light bulbs, or you might have, standard versus efficient refrigerators, or you might have different kind of cooking devices using different fuels. So that's the sort of way that you might break your data structure down into LEAP. And then the calculation of the energy consumption in LEAP is very simple. It's really just walking down the tree, multiplying these numbers together. So to get the total energy consumption down here at this branch in the tree, I'm using LEAP terminology here, we call this a branch in the tree, we just multiply these numbers together. So here we're going to say the total energy consumption here is going to be 8 million times 0.3 times 1.0 times 1.0 times 0.8 times 400 kilowatt hours per year. So that will give you the total consumption for lighting. So you can see it's very simple in principle what it's doing. The power of the model comes not from any sort of very complicated algorithms. The power comes from the fact that you can tell a story about how all these things are going to change. So what you've done here is you've broken your system down into manageable chunks where you can tell a plausible story. So here, for example, we can say, we know that the number of households, we know that there's population growth going on. So the number of households is going to grow over time. So that number in the future will grow over time. Similarly, we could do the same for urban versus rural. There's probably an urbanization process going on in most countries. So this number's going up, this number's going down. Similarly, here we could say, a greater fraction of households in the future, as incomes increase, more and more people will have refrigerators or air conditioners. So the kind of the saturation of the technology will go up over time. And then similarly, we can tell a story about technology change. Maybe even without specific policies, it's going to be a gradual shift from incandescent to LED lighting. In fact, there's really a great shift going on already. Excuse me. So we can tell stories about sort of technology change, and we can tell stories about sort of structural changes in the economy. And putting all those things together gives us a very reasonable way of simulating what the energy system might look like in the future, with and without different policies. So that's kind of a typical demand analysis. Similarly, under transformation, we can, based on our demand analysis, we can look at how our electric system might change over time. So we can think about things like what kind of power plants might we be building in the future. So we can look at sort of capacity expansion. We can look at sort of the megawatts of different power plants and, what type of power plants we might want to build in the future. And then we can also simulate a process of dispatch. So how do we run our power plants once we built them? Do we use our baseload plants like our our coal and our hydro? We probably dispatch them first. We probably dispatch any renewable plants first because they're sort of non-dispatchable plants. But then things like our peak load plants, like our oil-fired plants, we probably use those last. So LEAP has a way of letting you put all that information in and to simulate that process of capacity expansion and dispatch. And that lets you sort of accurately think about, what your energy system might look like in the future. And again, as I said, we give you sort of a choice of methodologies. So you can do something very simple where you just put in, I think I'm going to have 50% hydro today and 50% hydro in the future. Or you can actually do very sophisticated modeling where you actually have LEAP do an optimization calculation. So LEAP itself will tell you what plants it thinks you ought to build in order to keep costs to a minimum. So it does what's called like least cost optimization modeling. So again, the idea in LEAP is to give you a choice of methods so that you can get started fairly quickly, even if you don't have much data, but you can also graduate to more sophisticated methods. So I see a question here from Robert, which I'm sorry I didn't answer it earlier, which is how can one simplify household demand? Often only heating, hot water, and everything else is available in household consumption stats. Yeah, you're quite right, Robert. Quite often you don't have enough stats to do as detailed a breakdown as you would like. So, I mean, in LEAP, this structure is not fixed, right? This structure that I'm showing you, the different sectors and end uses, that will very much depend on the situation in your country. So in some countries, you might want to do a more detailed breakdown. In other countries, you have to do a much simpler breakdown. You might not even be able to do an end-use breakdown. So the idea in LEAP is, we give you lots of flexibility so you can do what's appropriate in your own country. Hopefully that answered your question. Okay, so that's transformation analysis. Let's see. So I just want to mention a couple more issues, and then I'm actually going to show you the software itself. So I mentioned this idea of flexible modeling, and very fundamental to LEAP is that we've kind of divided the task of modeling your energy system into sort of two levels. So the basic level is doing the sort of very non-controversial accounting calculations, and those are all handled internally in LEAP. So the kinds of things I was just describing to you, doing the sort of energy calculations and emissions that are, calculating emissions based on emission factors. All of that kind of thing is handled internally in LEAP. So LEAP is sort of doing all that basic sort of non-controversial accounting for you. But what you sometimes want to do is to build a kind of another level of modeling on top of that. So you might want to say, build a model that says that, I believe that the penetration of efficient light bulbs will be a function of the price of the light bulb and the price of the electricity. So if you want to, you can build your own models on top of the basic accounting in LEAP. And LEAP has this very powerful modeling language built into it. We call it a data definition language. And it allows you to define spreadsheet-like expressions that define the data, and it defines and describes how variables change over time. And those expressions can either be sort of very simple numbers, or they can be very complex formulae. But in order to help you build those models, we also provide a very large number of user-friendly software wizards that help you put the data in. So you don't have to write very complicated expressions yourself. You can actually use the tools in LEAP to help you build those kinds of functions. And I won't go into great detail about LEAP's application programming interface, but just to mention that you can also actually program LEAP yourself. And you can see a little screen over here where someone's writing a model that actually controls LEAP. So there's lots you can do with it if you really want to get into it, but you don't have to use those kinds of features if you don't want to. They're more kind of sort of advanced features. Okay, so let me just say a few words about some of the challenges in applying LEAP at the municipal scale. Sorry, just one second. Losing my voice there. So one thing is when you're using LEAP, what you're really thinking about is this idea of mitigation analysis, or at least you're thinking about alternative policies and what are the pros and the cons of alternative policies. So, if I'm at the municipal scale, what kind of policies should I be following in my city that will, make the city a better place to live, but maybe also lower the greenhouse gas emissions, but maybe even more important, improve the air quality in the city. So those are also the kinds of issues you can think about. Doing that kind of analysis, though, goes beyond just doing kind of emissions inventories. It requires more data, it requires more modeling expertise, and it really requires an end-use approach, so that you can think about what kinds of technologies might be introduced in the future. So that's a bigger task than just doing inventories. Inventories, typically, all you need to know is how much fuel is currently being burnt and what are reasonable emission factors, and you multiply those together to give you the total emissions. But doing mitigation really requires you to think about technology change. So you have to have a more detailed description of how energy is used in the country. So that's one of the challenges. It's just a bigger task than doing inventories. Also, it's hard to identify or it's hard to define boundaries and scope for city scale analyses. So typically in a city, you only have control over certain parts of the energy system. Maybe you have some control over building standards, or you have some control over, the roads that you build. But typically you don't have control over, what kind of electricity you're consuming. The electricity is probably generated in a national grid, and policies on electricity typically are controlled at the national scale. So it's hard to know what's the right boundary to draw around your system for modeling. And one approach that you can use there is to follow a scoping approach. So the Global Protocol for Community Scale Inventories, GPC, which I'm showing the report over there, which was developed by C40WRI and ICLEI. That's one good reference document you could use. So that's kind of like a protocol for thinking about how you should deal with these boundary issues. And you can certainly use tools like LEAP and many other tools to do your mitigation modeling while following those kind of protocols. I think maybe the biggest issue, if you're in a municipality and you're thinking about getting started doing sort of much more serious planning of greenhouse gas mitigation, is just sort of the challenge of applying tools, modeling tools. I think it's fair to say that when you're working at the municipal scale, you're in a much more difficult position than those working at national scale. You've probably got much less access to kind of institutional and human resources. You've probably got a fairly small team, and it's quite a challenge to start applying complex modeling tools. We had a seminar, I don't know if some of you came to it, in Kiev just recently, where a bunch of different models were presented to people from Ukraine who were doing this kind of activity at the city scale. And, I think it was quite daunting for people in the audience to listen to people talk about these very complicated models. So I think it's really crucial to try and identify a model that's powerful enough that it can meet your needs, but it's not so complex that maybe it's not really usable given your human and institutional resource limitations. So that's really something to think about. You've got to pick a tool that is appropriate for your data availability and your analytical needs and the resources you have available. Let's see. Yeah, so on that question of, so that's really sort of a key question that people ask me. Well, how easy is it to use something like LEAP? And I kind of want to give you an honest answer here. I don't want to tell you that it's super easy to use. So it is designed to make difficult and fairly complex analytical tasks approachable by those with little or no modeling background. So I don't think you have to have a team of experienced energy modelers in order to use LEAP. We have tried to make it usable by people who are maybe city scale planners. And one of the I mentioned this already, but one of the ways we've tried to make it easy is by making it flexible and transparent and giving you a choice of methods and making it only have very low initial data requirements. However, it is still a fairly serious endeavor. I don't want to tell you that using LEAP is the kind of thing that you can do in a few days. It probably is something that requires many months of effort. Also, probably it's something that if you're going to apply something like LEAP seriously, it would be good to think about getting some training in the software first. When we help people use LEAP at the national scale, and we've helped people all over the world do that, typically people will come ask either us or someone else to give them some training in the software before they get started. Typically, those trainings might last 3 to 5 days. Nevertheless, learning the software itself is not the main challenge in doing greenhouse gas mitigation at the municipal scale. The main challenges are things, first of all, it's like forming and then maintaining a skilled multidisciplinary team. So if you can think about these issues, you need not just modelers, but you also need various energy experts. So you probably need someone who knows about the transport sector, someone who knows about buildings, someone who knows about industry. You probably need environmental experts who can think about the emissions. You need economists, and you also need policy experts who can give you good, realistic guidance on what kind of policies might be realistic. It's also very important to engage with stakeholders and senior level decision makers so that any analysis you do is really going to feed into real world policy making. So many kind of modeling efforts tend to be rather academic exercises where someone goes off and does their own little model, but they're not really talking to stakeholders or decision makers. So they become an academic exercise. A report gets written, it gets put on a shelf, and everyone ignores it. So in order to avoid that, it's really important to be engaging. Another key challenge is getting access to sufficient reliable data, some of which may be proprietary. So some industries may not want to share their data. And then another key challenge is not just building a team, but also maintaining a team over the long run. Good people tend to come and go very quickly, and it's hard to maintain momentum for these kinds of efforts. So ideally, it's good if you're running this if you're in it for the long run. You're setting up a team that's going to be there for many years. If you're just doing a project that lasts 3 to 4 months, it's very hard to maintain what you've learned in the project for the long term. And I would also say that using consultants to do these studies, which is a way that countries often go, people look at these tasks and think this is too complex, so we're going to hire some consultants to do it. But that typically does not lead to much learning. It doesn't lead to much capacity building in the cities or in the countries themselves. And you really need that capacity. You need to be able to sort of think about your vision for what kind of system you're analysing in the future, and that really requires long-term capacity building. I'm just going to look at some of the questions you've asked here. So Robert says, smaller municipalities often have data collected in Excel sheets. Do you provide Excel templates which could be used for standardizing data collection and then import those into LEAP directly? So Robert, LEAP is very good at talking to tools like Excel. It's very good at pulling in data from other models and other spreadsheets. So yes, you can do that. At the moment, we don't have super standard templates. It's fairly flexible in how it can do that. I've got a slide coming in a minute that will mention some of the things we're doing in the future to try and streamline that and make it much more efficient. So bear with me and I'll mention something in a minute about that. And then someone else says, are you providing training for a fee? I think is the question. And the answer to that is yes, I'm afraid. Yes, we do not have the resources to provide free trainings at the moment. I wish we did, but we don't. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is just switch over to LEAP itself and give you a hint of how some of these things that I mentioned actually work in practice. So I'm going to switch over now to a running copy of LEAP. Hopefully you can all see that on your screen. The screen doesn't seem to be refreshing quite right. There we go. So what I'd like to show you here is basically just that same information we were looking at before, and I want to show you how you actually put some of that data into LEAP. So I'll go through this fairly quickly. So do you remember before I showed you a screen saying that you can break things down by sector and subsector? Well, here's an example of how we do that in LEAP. Maybe before I get into that, I should just tell you what the screen layout is. So this is actually the main screen in LEAP. And this is the place where, and then the way the software is structured is it's structured as different views onto an energy system. So at the moment, we're looking at the analysis view, which is the place where you build your model of your energy system. It's also the place where you put in all the data, and it's the place where you manage different scenarios. So your scenarios are just sort of alternative stories about how your system might evolve over time into the future. So here we have our energy demands. Down here we have our transformation sector, and down here we have resources. So these we call this the tree. This is kind of like the main data structure in LEAP. So this is kind of like the main description of how energy is consumed and produced in your country. Sorry. Okay, so down here we have energy demand broken down by sector. Let's walk down the tree and look at some of the sub branches. So here we have households broken down into urban versus rural. Here we have urban is all electrified, so that means all of the urban households have electricity. And then here we have different end uses. Here was the one I showed you before. We have lighting, or we have refrigeration, and down here we have cooking. So you can see these are kind of the end uses are kind of the reason that people need energy, and then below that we have different technologies that utilize fuels to provide those end uses. So here, for example, we have two different kinds of cooking in this country. This country, by the way, is Fredonia, which is LEAP's sample data set. It's not a real country. It's just an example data set. So here we have cooking broken down into electric versus natural gas stoves. So let's just like walk down the tree and you can see those numbers that I was mentioning earlier. So here we have 8 million households. 30% of those are urban. So I'm going to click on urban. All of those households are electrified. Here we have different end uses. So everyone does cooking, everyone does lighting, but only 95% of people have a refrigerator. If we look down at cooking, you can see there's 30% use electric stoves and the rest use natural gas stoves. So for the most part, you're just entering very simple numbers that describe what the country looked like in the base year of the study. So that's kind of like the first year of your analysis. That's what we call the current accounts data in LEAP. So the current accounts is like, what did the system look like in the base year? And I think in this model, the base year is 2010. I'm not sure if that's right. Apologies, I'm starting to lose my voice. Okay, so here, if we walk down the tree, we just basically multiply these numbers together to calculate the number of people in urban households cooking with electricity or cooking with natural gas. And then over here, there's another variable called the final energy intensity. So this variable is just describing activities. It's not describing any energy use. Here we have a final energy intensity, which is how much energy is required to provide that cooking end use. So here we have two different numbers, which is the energy consumption in electric and natural gas stoves. So basically those numbers are multiplied by the numbers that you've put in here. So far, very simple, I think. Then what we can do is we can say, yes, but how are these numbers going to change over time? So now let's switch away from current accounts and talk about a scenario. So here, let's look at what might be a baseline or a reference scenario. And you can see here, instead of simple numbers, we're going to put in expressions using LEAP's data definition language. We're going to put in expressions that say how these numbers change over time. So here, I hope everyone can see this. Let me make it slightly bigger. So here we're putting in a growth rate that says the number of households is going to grow at 3% a year. So this is like a little equation that LEAP lets you put in that says how numbers change over time. So here we're doing it as a growth rate. Here's another equation that says, here's an interpolation function. So this is saying the number of urban households grows from 30% in 2010 to 45% in 2040. So those are the kinds of equations you can put in to LEAP that let you specify how data changes over time. And these equations are very flexible. So here, for example, we said it's growing at 3% a year, but maybe it only grows at 3% initially. Maybe after 2020, it slows down and only grows at 1%. So if I adjust that function there, you can very quickly see down the bottom how the numbers change over time. I could even put in a negative growth rate there. I could say after 2030, it's going to decline at minus 1% a year. So you can start to construct very sophisticated descriptions of how numbers change over time. Same here, I could say this value is already 45% in 2020. If I do that, you can see it grows from 30 to 45 and then stays constant. Okay. I'm going to get rid of that because I don't want to show you these later on. Oops, it didn't work. Here, I'm going to keep it very simple. Okay. All right, so basically, that's the way that you describe how numbers change over time in LEAP. So let me just mention one other thing here. LEAP is very good at helping you manage scenarios. So I hope you can notice that some of this text is black on white, whereas some of it's blue on white. Black on white means that this was an equation that you specified in a higher level scenario, and it's inherited that equation in the current scenario. So here in the reference scenario, you can see this equation that said that natural gas is the remainder versus electricity. That's black on white because that expression stays the same, whereas the blue on white equations are things that we specifically put in this scenario. So in the current accounts, we said the expression is 8. But in the reference scenario, we've said there's a growth rate, so it's describing how it changes over time. Now, in a policy scenario, typically in a policy scenario, we want to keep all the same assumptions as the reference scenario, except for where we're pursuing individual technologies. So, for example, let's look at a policy scenario where we're looking at efficient refrigerators. You can see everything's black on white, so that means everything is the same as the reference scenario in terms of cooking. But if we look at refrigerators, you can see there's one blue on white equation. So here we're saying in our efficient refrigerator scenario, we're going to be getting rid of our standard refrigerators and then gradually replacing them over time. So beginning in 2014, this is rather an old data set, we're going to be getting rid of our existing refrigerators so that by 2025, we're using all efficient refrigerators. And you can see the difference between the two. The efficient refrigerators have much less energy consumption than the existing refrigerators. So that's kind of the way that you define data. You get to sort of put in these equations, and the equations are inherited across scenarios, so it's very efficient to define and explore new scenarios. Right, let's look at some results. So I'm going to flip over now to the results view. And it's actually had to do a calculation there. because I'd made some changes. But you can see the calculations are very fast. It only takes a few seconds. In fact, it takes less than a second to do this calculation in this very simple data set. So let's look at some results now. Let's start by looking at the energy demand results. So you can see I'm looking at this same tree. Again, I've got the same sort of sectoral breakdown in the results view. And what I can do is I can explore in the tree different kinds of results. So here I'm clicking on the demand branch, and I'm looking at the energy demand result, and I'm seeing how it changes over time. So when it does a calculation, it basically walks down all of those tree branches, does the calculations of energy, multiplies that by the emission factors to give you the total emission loadings, and it does that for every single year in every scenario. So it's just sort of a series of loops for the calculation it's doing. So the individual calculations are simple, but the result is a big database for different years and for different scenarios. So here we're looking at the results for the reference scenario over time, and we're organizing the results by branch. So branches are the branches in the tree or the sectors. So here we've organized the data by household, industry, transport, commercial. So you can see the demand is growing over time because of our assumptions about growth rates for the there's growth going on in the transport sector, the household sector, etc., etc. This results view is kind of like a pivot table in Excel. It lets you organize the results almost any way you like. So here we're seeing results with the years down the bottom and the sectors in the legend, and we're looking at one particular scenario, and we're looking at the results for all fuels. So we could just say, what's the result just for electricity? So there you can see a slightly different set of numbers. This is just the electricity consumption in those sectors. Well, here's the results for all fuels. Or we could organize it down here so that we're looking at the results not by sector, but by fuel. So if I click on this, we could say I want to see all fuels. So this is the same results, but just chopped up in a different way. So rather than organizing it by sector, we're organizing it by fuel. Then we go back to the sectors. Or you can say I want to see it at multiple levels. So here I'm just seeing the sectors, but I might want to see the sectors and the subsectors. So by doing two levels up here, we're actually showing you two levels of results down here. And that's quite nice when you're looking at that in a table view. So anything you look at as a chart, you can also look at as a table. So here's those same numbers viewed as a table. You can see here's the sectors broken down into subsectors, or you can see a split view where you're doing the two things together. Okay. So let me just show you a couple more results. I can see I'm rapidly running out of time here, so I should try to go a little bit quicker. So that was looking at energy demand results, but we might also want to look at emissions results. So let's switch over now to look at our greenhouse gas emissions. So here I'm going to look at 100-year global warming potential, and I'm going to look at the results at the point of emissions. So here, if I click right up on the top branch, you can see, let's just do one level. So you can see some of my emissions come from my demand sectors. So this would be kind of like using gasoline in cars or using natural gas for cooking. But then some of my emissions come from my electric generation sector. And if I do two levels, you can see a bit more detail. So here's my transport emissions, here's my commercial emissions, but here's my electric generation emissions. Now, when you're working at the municipal scale, this is kind of quite a challenge, right? If you're thinking about policies, you want to say, if I do a policy, say on to use more energy more efficiently in buildings, what's going to be the impact of that? So here, for example, you might have, let's look at a policy that's our mitigation scenario where we've done a bunch of emissions reductions. So you can see it's a slightly different number. It's a little bit difficult to tell the difference. So the mitigation scenario is 110. The reference scenario is 150. One of the things you can do in LEAP is to say, I want to see the difference between scenarios, or I want to see what I've avoided versus my reference scenario. So let's select the mitigation scenario, click on more, and then say, I want to see avoided versus reference. So this is quite a useful chart. This is here you're seeing your mitigation scenario, and then the dotted line is the emissions that you avoided versus your reference scenario. Sorry, give me 1 second. Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. But now, if I'm pursuing certain policies, so when you're working at the municipal scale, typically your policies will all be down here under your households, transport, and industry sectors. You don't have much control about what happens here, but still, you want to see the implications of doing policy here on what it does to reduce your overall emissions. So let me show you how you can look at that. So here, for example, let's just look at the direct emissions under demand. I'm going to get rid of this avoided reference scenario. So here, if we just look at the emissions from the demand side on its own, it can be a little bit misleading. So here you can see it looks like most of our emissions are in the transport sector, but we don't have too many emissions coming from the household and industry sector. But that's kind of misleading, right? Because here we're actually burning gasoline and diesel directly. But here we're mainly using electricity and other fuels, so there's not many direct emissions under households. But that's because we're using electricity, which is made down here under electricity. So if you want to know the implications of your policies, you really need to be able to take the emissions happening in transformation and allocate them back to your demand side. So let me show you this alternative way of looking at numbers. So instead of looking at the direct emissions, let's look at the direct plus the indirect emissions allocated back to the demands. So now you get a more accurate picture. Here we're seeing not just the direct emissions in the households, but the emissions that came from electric generation caused by the consumption of electricity in households. So this kind of result, I think, is quite useful when you're doing municipal scale modeling, where you want to see the implications of your policies. Okay, so those are some of the kind of results that you can get out of LEAP, and I think I've just about run out of time. I could have shown you a bunch of other things, but we're rapidly running out of time. So I think what I'm going to do is pause here and give you a chance to ask some questions. And I can see that people have already asked a few questions, but Thor, I don't know if it's possible to do it via audio, or is it only going to be possible to do it via chat?
You mean the questions being asked by audio, or
should we do the questions by chat and then I'll?
Yes, I mean, like, if you prefer them to be by audio, I guess that will be all right, though it might turn a little bit chaotic. So since they are already writing the questions by chat, perhaps we can start there.
Yeah, okay, all right, so let's do that. So please, if you have any additional questions, please do type them in the chat window, and I can see there's a few there now, so I'll start on those. So Ricardo says, I'd like to know how I can consider emissions associated with the transportation of fuels, e.g. natural gas biomass pellets. Now, I'm not quite sure I understand your question there, Ricardo. Are you saying you want to know the emissions from transporting the natural gas, or do you want to know the emissions from burning those fuels in a transportation system? From transporting natural gas. Okay, yes, so that would come down here under transformation. You would typically have pipelines going on here. So those pipelines might be transporting natural gas. There's some energy required to move the natural gas, but there's also going to be leakages of methane. So you would look at those sort of those leakage losses down here under your transformation modeling. And as I was just showing you, those emissions can then be allocated back to the demand side to see what the implications are on a sort of more on a consumption basis. I hope that answers your question. Pavel has a question. Is it possible national data to be imported to the software, like specific energy consumption prices, etc.? Yes, it is. In fact, when you're making a model at the municipal scale, I think it's probably unavoidable that you won't find all the data you need for your individual city. So you're going to probably have to use some of the numbers that may be relevant at the national scale, and you'll have to sort of make some adjustments, but assume they're more or less suitable at the city scale. You might even have to use some international data numbers. There isn't going to be one single source of data that goes into LEAP. You're going to be having to search around for different kinds of data. So some of it will be energy intensities, some of it will be sort of activity level data. That's kind of really the challenge in using LEAP, is piecing those different sources of data together to make a reasonable overall data set. Another really big challenge is sort of calibrating the data set. So it's really important that you have some idea of the sort of the total energy consumption in the city, so that when you do your bottom-up analysis, you'll have to go through a process of calibrating the model to make sure it gives you reasonable results. Yeah? And by reasonable, I mean, calibrated to some expected numbers for total energy consumption or total emissions. So typically, if you've already got an inventory for the city, that's a good thing to calibrate against. Let's see. Hope that answered your question. Now, Robert says, is avoided only available as a total sum, or can I display from which sector, subsector it's coming? Well, that particular chart I was showing you, it only shows you one number for avoided, but you can always show each of the individual scenarios. So I think Robert was asking about this. If he shows a mitigation scenario and shows avoided versus a reference scenario, it will show this kind of chart. But of course, you can always look at the individual results for each scenario. You can also look at differences in scenarios. So that's a slightly different way of looking at it. So that's like one scenario minus another. And you can also do this, which is a wedge chart, which shows you how do you go from your reference scenario, which is kind of the top line, down to your mitigation scenario. So this is showing you how you get from one scenario to another. So there's lots of different ways of showing these charts. You don't have to even show the years down on the bottom. I could show the fuels down here, for example. There's all sorts of different things you can show. Ooh, that's not a very good one. So here, for example, maybe it's better to show fuels up here. Oops. So here's a chart that shows you sectors on the bottom and fuels as on the legend, and you can even sort of you can even show that 4 different years, and you can even animate it so you can see how things change over time. There's probably like thousands of different charts and tables you can get out of LEAP. Let's see, any other questions? Will the presentation be available for download? Yes, I think so. And I assume that you're recording the webinar as well, so I suppose the webinar will also be available to watch later on. But Thor, maybe you can confirm that.
Indeed, Charles, and for Robert, who has the question, both the webinar is being recorded and the presentation will be available in our website, at our trainings and webinars section. As well as the previous webinars that are already there. So there is no problem with that particular issue for anyone who wants to review all the information.
Great, thank you. And I suppose also I can share the webinar and the presentation on the LEAP Facebook page. Let me just quickly, I don't think I mentioned what was the address of that. I'm just going to show you very quickly the LEAP website. If I can get an internet connection here. So this is the LEAP website I'm showing on my screen here, energycommunity.org. From there, you can also follow a link down here to visit the LEAP Facebook group, which is also very active. I think we have 1,500 or 1,200 members, I think, somewhere now. So I usually share news about LEAP very frequently on the LEAP website, and I will certainly post the presentation, and if it's okay with Thor, I will post the webinar up here as well, so you can get at it that way as well. So
most certainly, Charles.
The Facebook page is facebook.com/groups/LEAP software. Let's see. When is the next LEAP training? Ricardo asks. We're doing a training next week in Chile. At the moment, we don't have funding to do regular kind of all-comers trainings. I wish we did, and that's something I will try and work on getting funding for over the next few years. But we do quite often run sort of regional workshops. Typically, they tend to be sponsored by groups like UNFCCC or UNDP. I hope we will do some more of those again in the future. But we don't at the moment run regular workshops, but we do run many workshops. They're just not sort of run on a regular all-comers basis, but we will try and work on that in the future. Okay, now I see a question from Robert that says, most cities import all their electricity with a given mix. Scenarios could include local solar, PV production, with the aim to increase self-sufficiency. How is this done in LEAP? That's quite a complicated question to answer, Robert. But maybe all I can say at this moment is that you certainly can look at those kinds of things. You can look at sort of local generation, but you can also look at sort of importing electricity from sort of outside the boundary. So really the key issue is not so much with the software, it's more just sort of how do you choose to draw the boundary around the analysis that you're doing. So LEAP and most other models are pretty flexible about that, but it's more just a question of thinking about where you want to draw the boundaries. Do you actually want to, for example, like we've been doing it recently for some states in the US, we've been modeling the energy consumption in the demand sectors, but then when we think about the electricity, it doesn't make, so we've been doing like states in the US, but it doesn't really make sense to count up the power plants in a particular state because that state is really part of a much wider grid. It's part of a regional grid for the whole of, like we've been doing Rhode Island, and it takes its electricity from the whole of New England and Canada even. So what we typically do is we measure the consumption of electricity in the state, and then we assume that supply comes from the region as a whole. So we just look at what's the mix for the region as a whole and what are the average emission factors for the region as a whole. So therefore we capture, properly what the emissions implications are of different consumption policies. So that's the kind of thing you can do, but it's fairly flexible. Okay, Leonardo says, we got a few more minutes here, or should we stop, or should I just take like 2 more?
I mean, it's up to you, Charles.
Okay.
But I
guess
that we should start closing the session.
Okay, well, I just take there's one more question here. I'll just take this one, and I see there's 2 more here, so I'll just take these 2 more questions and then we'll cut it off there. So the first question is from Leonardo, and he says, "Please say something about LEAP-WEEP linking." So maybe I need to tell you what WEEP is before I tell you about LEAP-WEEP linking. So WEEP is, for those who haven't come across it, WEEP is like the sister software to LEAP. So LEAP is for energy and climate change mitigation. WEEP is for thinking about water resource planning and it's more focused on climate adaptation. So WEEP is available from the SEI website in a similar way that LEAP is, and it is also possible to link the 2 of them together so you can look at how do energy and water systems interact with each other. So, for example, you might look at demand for energy in LEAP, and you might look at hydropower availability in WEEP, and you might use the hydropower availability in WEEP to help you do a better job of modeling your electric system in LEAP. So those 2 systems can be used together, but probably I can't say too much more on that at the moment. But there certainly is this other system called WEEP, and you certainly can link them together. Now, the final question, Anita says, "Can you tell about LEAP and crystal ball linking?" Wow, that's a very detailed question, Anita. So for those of you who don't know, crystal ball is a piece of software for doing Monte Carlo analysis. So Monte Carlo is basically a way of thinking about uncertainty. It's an add-in to Excel. Unfortunately, it needs to be purchased, but it's something you can add into Excel, and you can use systems like that in conjunction with LEAP to explore uncertainty. So LEAP itself does not do uncertainty, right? A scenario in LEAP has, one set of results. There's no probabilities involved. But what you can do with Crystal Ball is you can actually use that to consider some of the key inputs into LEAP and consider some of the probability distributions involved in some of the key inputs to LEAP. So, for example, what is your what level of penetration can you get for renewables? That you might not just have one number, you might have a range of numbers with a probability distribution, or what's the likely GDP growth rate in the future. So it is possible to use LEAP with Crystal Ball. In fact, I actually have a little sample a sample data set that shows how to link up LEEP to Crystal Ball. So Anita, if you would like to email me, or anyone else, if you'd like to email me separately, I can send you a sample data set that actually shows how to use LEEP with Crystal Ball to do Monte Carlo analysis. You will need to have a copy of Crystal Ball, unfortunately. So if you haven't already got it, I'm afraid you need to purchase a copy. But yes, it is possible to use those systems together, and it's quite powerful, quite interesting what you can do with them, actually. At some point, I might try and run a webinar on that topic. Okay, so I'm sorry that wasn't a very detailed answer to your question, but please get in contact with me if you're interested in that topic. Let me just say, if you want to get in contact with us, the best email address to contact me on is leap@SEI-US.org, leap@SEI-US.org, and our website, the best website to look for information about LEAP is this one, the LEAP website, www.energycommunity.org. And please do also, I really encourage you to join the Facebook page, which is a nice friendly place for people to share stories about how they're using LEAP. And that's facebook.com/groups/LEAP software. I would say that we don't provide technical support on the Facebook page. It's just a place for sort of exchanging stories and pictures. All the technical support happens here on this LEAP website under this discussion option here. You can see there's lots and lots and lots of questions that people have posted. It's a very, very active group. So please do post your questions here. But if you've got, if you're doing any LEAP activities, we'd love to see pictures of how you're using it. You can share them up here on the LEAP Facebook page. So I'll leave it at that for now before I totally lose my voice. Thanks everyone for listening, and thanks for hosting it, Thor.
Thank you very much to you, Charles. Actually, it was a fantastic presentation, and we really appreciate